A very good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for joining with us today. So I'm Jacqueline, along with Dan, would be co-moderating this session, the session on localized financing for climate change adaptation, reducing loss and damage, and inequity cycles. So we all know we are here for our planet, which is facing the real-life consequences, and we need to adapt to it. And when options exist, but our community doesn't have the resources to access or utilize them, loss and damage is and will continue to harm the vulnerable communities the most, making addressing the issue a matter of climate justice. So with this, the session would address the two objectives: share knowledge on gaps, challenges, and solutions of localized financing for climate change adaptation and loss and damage. And the second is facilitate a discussion among local communities, member states, and researchers about challenges and good practices for financing for climate change adaptation. So with this, a very, very warm welcome, and I hand it over to my co-moderator, Dan, to move ahead, as I already mentioned about the vulnerable communities.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. I know that there are many competing activities, including one that's on almost the same topic, but I guarantee you're in the right room. This is the better one of the two. It'll be more interesting, more dynamic, more grassroots, exactly what you're looking for. It says it on the bottle. So the way we're going to try to paint this morning session, going into afternoon session, is that first we'll talk about a couple of the challenges that various communities are facing, and then some of the solutions that they're using to address that. That's the first panel, and we'll have an open Q&A session after that, in case something comes up during that first bit. And then the second half, we'll go into some of the financing mechanisms and solutions opportunities. So that's just a quick layout. And our first two speakers will be answering questions around the current risks, impacts, and challenges that climate change poses. And then the second one is more along the lines of some of the solutions that local communities are implementing. So we are very pleased to be joined by two wonderful speakers. And I'll just introduce them both now so we don't have to keep going back to Dan and then back to them. It's too much back and forth. So first we have Abraham Bugre, who's a contact point for the Nature Working Group and the Youth Climate Movement, YOUNGO, which some of you, I believe, have heard of before. He's a PhD student at the University of Regina, exploring the subject of female smallholder farmers and their response to climate change in Ghana. So I'll turn straight to him in a moment, but after him will be followed by Dr. Lynn Wilson, who founded the global research and education NGO SeaTrust Institute. She's executive director, heading its UNFCCC and other delegations since 2007. So if you want to know how it's evolved over the past 15 years, she's the go-to person. She also has served as a reviewer for the IPCC AR5 and AR6, and if you know what that is, you're amazing. And as author and lecturer on climate change adaptation issues, leading capacity development field projects also in Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. So we'll turn first to Abraham. You have about 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll nudge you gently when you get there. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I think today's topic is really one that speaks to me because of the work that I do and how I've interacted with local people over the years, young people, and just generally those who are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And for local communities, we see that when we go in there, climate change is not just, the scientific and political discussion that we are having. It's their livelihoods. It's what is happening to them every single day. And we see that because of the various sociocultural, challenges that they have, sometimes in terms of having access to resources, financial, status of folks in local communities. And these have been some of the major things that we see to be increasing or making it disproportionately impacting in terms of climate change on their life and their livelihoods. And this is what I have been working with in terms of young people, in terms of women who are, like household leaders. These are the real people that are having to deal with climate change. And I'd give an example for my PhD research when I was interviewing a young woman farmer and in the northern part of Ghana. And she had put so much behind her farm. And then there were no rains. And finally, when the rains came, it swept away everything that she had planted. And I remember talking to her and asking her, how did she cope with that? And I was busily taking my notes, and recording. But when I turned and looked at her, I saw tears coming down her eyes when she was speaking. Because it's not just about reporting these issues. It's not just about writing them in the newspapers. For them, it is the reality. For them, it is what is happening to them. And I give another example of a young gentleman also from Ghana. We had this youth in agriculture program. We're training young people to start, planting and farming. And this guy gave an example where when he had finished college, he had no job. And everyone in the country keeps saying, oh, the young people are lazy. There's land. Why don't you just go into farming? And he had this talk about, when he plants maize, just use some small money, he would be able to harvest 50 bags and make more money. And he was interested. Borrowed money from his uncle, started a farm, and then there was drought. No rains. He lost everything. Now he has to pay it back. This is the reality of how climate change is disproportionately impacting young people, women, people of disabilities in our local communities. And I feel this is why this topic is really important, because we have to look at how it's impacting them, how we're able to support them, what kind of financial structures do we put in place to be able to build their resilience. And that is what I have to share.
I thank my youth colleague, Abraham. I would say that in every aspect, youth are the key players for climate change adaptation to make any sense. What if we could put together an intergenerational adaptation approach that starts in community but is connected to global efforts? We talk about this all the time, but that actually is driven by the community in which youth help to frame what that looks like. Most of our verbiage and funding for things like this comes in the terms of blended finance, which has kind of gotten a bit of a bad name over the last few years because it was down 160% in the last couple of years. It's made a little comeback. But global finance, as it has been structured, might need to be rethought. So I'm going to share with you an example of something that is outside of my role as SeaTrust Institute, but in another hat I wear as a Rotarian. We have a project in the low-lying Midlands of the UK, which is prone to flooding and a lot of infrastructure, so forth, issues called Rivers to the Sea, in which we are piloting an intergenerational adaptation program where the adults go out with youth, they take a multi-parameter monitor, stick it in the water, take all of this information, it goes up to a GIS database that we've had done and that is public facing to show what's in the water. We have a network attached to this where we invite science experts, finance experts, policy experts, so that everyone is speaking the same language, but it comes back to the network where the youth are part of defining what it is we want to say. Now, it's piloted and it's working fine within this group and the Great Britain and Ireland, but because it's within Rotary, I'm also part of a group called Cadre where we assign grants and we monitor grants. The idea is to take this to all of the countries that for 40 years we've had polio work and water work and so forth, and take this work through the various countries to engage youth in helping plan the project. Rotary International has just started a program where the youth clubs can apply for grants directly through the international program if they partner with an adult organization. So we're saying this is the time to partner with other finance organizations. We've had some very interesting interest from a World Yachting Organization, from other people who would like to see this. But again, the key to making this work is having it be a youth partnership. We started this and I thought the youth would want to lead the projects. Well, I was wrong. They didn't want to lead the projects. I'm also a professor. I'm wrong a lot. And so I said, well, what do you want? And they said, we want to work with the adults who know how the process works and learn and get but be listened to. Have it be an iterative project so that they could indeed do what we used to talk about of standing on our shoulders and moving on. That's the point of doing this. So after we come back to the network, work on all of this, we're going that next step. Rotary International has a new partnership with UNEP, which is another way to go with this. Now they're doing trash cleanup along rivers in various places. That's where we started too, in our little backyard, hadn't talked with one another. But now we're doing the water chemistry monitoring, we're working biodiversity, and again, training people how to speak about this so we're all saying the same thing to get the results community-based that we want. So here's the point. This work has all been done by volunteers. And we need now some new partners, some finance partners beyond where we are. So what if you joined us? We invite you to join us in this network, in this partnership, and help us make this kind of thing a reality. And maybe you're a science expert or a finance expert or a young person, whatever you bring to the table. We need you. And hopefully we can offer something that would be useful to you. There's also innovation we've never thought of. One of my favorite authors starts out saying, what's the biggest brown-eyed mammal you've never heard of? Well, I know that we haven't heard of all the brown-eyed mammals, and you all may have some innovations that we've never thought of, and we welcome those. So I'm excited to hear what our finance partners here might have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you both have set a first in COP history, which is both of you spoke under the time asked. I don't think that's ever happened. So another round of applause for setting a good precedent. But also, while I'm dilly-dallying, I'm curious if any of you have thought of any questions you might wish to ask these two lovely souls about their work, about what they've experienced, about what they're studying or researching, just to make it a little bit more dynamic in the room. Please, just one at a time. Yes, please, sir. I think we had a microphone before. We do have one.
I've heard about
Let's hope it's working. Let's see.
Technology, great when it works.
I have another microphone.
perfect. Well, thank you. I guess my question is, what sort of finance do you need? Because clearly you're articulating a problem, but what's your suggested finance solution?
What kind of finance do we need is your question, if I'm understanding it right. Well, we need finance partners who would help us get the developing countries in the places that need the ability to have both the training and the monitoring of what's going on in their own waters. We have a probe. It cost all of $1,200 USD, all right? But then there's a consumable with it. And while the Rotary clubs right now are picking it up in the pilot, we can't do this all over the world, all right? And so we need that sort of thing. But we also need money for training because we have the training agents, we have the university partners, but we have to pay them to do that training so that everybody is learning how to use the equipment properly and maintain it and also report it properly. Again, from the volunteer effort, we have enterprise level GIS specialists working with us, so we've got that part volunteered. There's a lot of this that's all been volunteered, but in order to promulgate it, we need some good partners in finance. Thank you for your question.
I'll start by saying the type of finance we need. We need ones that have less bureaucratic requirements. And I say this because I'm from the, yeah, that's a good place to clap. Because I'm with YOUNGO, I'm with the youth constituency, and we see all these very crazy, requirements when young people want to access finance. And for example, I tell you, working within the African youth space, African young people are notorious for doing a lot with very little. And if we just had a little bit more to support us, we could do more. And sometimes you find young people who have an organization that is not registered, doesn't have elders and all that, but then there is probably a grant that they could have accessed, but then they have to fill all these forms, show 5 years reports and financial statements and all these things. We need very flexible financial instruments that accommodate young people, accommodate local people. And I totally agree with her. Some of these ones have to be in a way where it's more collaborative, and you're kind of learning whilst implementing. And I'll give you one quick example. We had a project, I was working with the Youth Climate Council in Ghana, which we set it up as various young people, youth organizations that are working on climate change coming together, forming a council to influence policy. So we started this council, and then we had a great partnership with UNICEF Ghana. So what they did was they gave us the money. They're kind of like supervising us, but at the same time, they are working with us. And so they are kind of training us whilst we are implementing projects, whilst we are training, whilst we are building the capacity. So all this type of finance, I think that is what we need. So I would say that type of finance is also really important. Thanks.
So are there other questions? If not, I also have maybe a small thing to add to this, another narrative that I've heard about. There was a community that wanted to have a school. This is in the Central African Republic. They were hoping to have a school so that their, of course, children could get educated. This was one area around which they could all agree. So they went seeking funding. And the particular funder that they turned to responded to them and said, well, what have you done to establish ownership in the community around this issue? So they said, okay. So what they did was they actually started building the bricks themselves that they could lay into what would then become a school, because they don't need outside funding for that. That's something that they know how to do. What they needed the funding for was the roof. So the community decided that if they started building the school, that then the funder would say, you have community ownership now. And that was sort of in lieu of the bureaucratic barriers. It was a demonstration-based effort to show that there is community engagement, community ownership, and then the funding came in because that sort of investment had already been made. It was a different approach. And then, of course, the roof came, and they now have functioning schools, and that model has been replicated throughout the Central African Republic and actually in much of sub-Saharan Africa. So are there other questions? I will say it's very interesting in the modern day moderating a panel, because it is everybody, and I'm the same, everybody looks down at their phone, and I'm assuming that you're all taking copious notes of the brilliant things that are being said up here. But please feel free to look up every once in a while just to smile and say hi, because I don't always know what's going on in your heads. And also, if you have questions, you're most welcome to ask. So perhaps I'll actually now turn the floor over to our second panel while you think of other questions, both for them and for the general conversation. Yes, oh, there's a question, fantastic. There are two questions, even more fantastic. First we'll take yours, and then there's a woman behind you as well.
Well, so how much of, besides like having access to different sources of finance, how much of the problem becomes like lack of financial or potential lack of financial literacy in areas that are most affected by climate change?
Perfect. And let's take the other question first,
Okay.
and then we'll do a round of answers, and then the second panel.
Hello. I just hear a meeting. They talk about the UN have a framework to talk about the knowledge sharing. It names UN4NAP. I just know that you have experience or any sort of command of how to use it to support the vulnerable capacity. And because before the financial coming us, and what can we do? Do you have experience to use this framework? It's useful or not?
Is there another question? Yes, great. Gentlemen. Oh, look at this. It's a hot audience now.
Hi. So I believe one of the biggest issues that we're facing when it comes to financing is it's a bit transactional. Like a lot of financing has become a bit transactional. So how do you think we can move from transactional financing to something a bit more systemic?
Perfect. So we'll turn first, if you don't mind, to Dr. Wilson, and then to future Dr. Bougre.
I'm his worst nightmare. Okay. Because I have PhD students. All right, so I think the first question was about financial literacy. Financial literacy is a huge part of it and that is the whole point of partnering with people who have a lot of financial literacy in this in terms of the project that I mentioned. Because you have people here who have run major projects, businesses, universities, whatever, to help spearhead that and also run through a global organization that has had 40 years of understanding how to do this. But the training of the youth is the piece in terms of being sure that the youth are also trained in that financial literacy so they don't go to the position he was talking about where they have all these forms to fill out, they don't know how to do it, and so forth. So it is truly capacity building and enabling in financial literacy which is why I said we invite our finance partners too in the education side as well, and I think it's very, very critical. The second question was about knowledge sharing, and I didn't understand, I couldn't hear quite everything you said, but I think you said how valuable did we find the knowledge sharing approach. Is that what you're saying? I think it's absolutely critical. I think you have to be able to have a mechanism, though. You can't just sort of share knowledge out there, just sort of in general. You have to have some sort of a funnel, a mechanism where people are collaboratively sharing it and creating new knowledge. One of the most important things that gets missed is that sometimes it isn't just what you come and dump in the middle of the table that you know in knowledge sharing. It is breaking those bounds and asking the new question. That's where things happen. That's where knowledge sharing takes when you get people together from different disciplines, different areas, different capabilities, then that's where knowledge sharing can take off, because then they will ask the next best question. We're not going to have an end point. We're going to have a series of questions. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. Okay. And then our third question, it was, okay, and I apologize. Would you reiterate slightly what you had to say?
Yes, I was concerned that a lot of financing has become transactional. So my question was, how will you suggest we move from transactional financing to something a bit more systemic?
And something more systemic past transactional. That again, thank you. That again goes back to a process and having people in the process where it isn't just a single finance entity that has come in and said, this is what you're going to do, so therefore what you do has to match our view of transactional finance. And I think it becomes negotiated among the financial entities. And if you don't do that, then the people who are financing it end up calling the shots for what the actual adaptation is. And this becomes particularly problematic when you have young people, because they will age out and they go into a next set. And so it has to be an entire process, which speaks to knowledge sharing, financial literacy, and it also speaks to a legal mechanism of putting things in place whereby they actually have the capability of seeing action on the ground happen at the community-based level. Over to you, Abraham.
All right, thank you. I think I totally agree with Professor Lin, because when you talk about financial literacy, it's about capacity building, right? It's about building the capacity of the young people, of people in the local communities to be able to understand all these systems. And she gave that brilliant example where it has to be a collaborative process. It has to be a co-production process. So you don't just expect that people would, or young people or local communities would know how to satisfy the different financial requirements. You have to actually do it with them, build it with them. And that comes also with, the issue of knowledge sharing. It's really important to know best practices. But unfortunately, recently I've been really skeptical and very cautious about the use of best practices, because sometimes you find donors and big organizations just pick a best practice somewhere and just come and dump it somewhere and say, oh, this is knowledge sharing. You're just bringing something that is being done in Namibia to Nigeria, and it doesn't work. And even within my PhD thesis, I was working within one district in Ghana. But within the district, you have different communities, different geographies, and even landscapes. And you realize that you cannot apply what would be best practice in one community to another. And that is even on a very micro scale. So best practices and knowledge sharing is good, but it has to be done in very, very systematic and good context. Otherwise, it might be abuse. And so that's what I would share on that. Thank you.
Just to add to that, I don't think there are any best practices. I think there are wise ones and some that aren't so wise, but perhaps not best.
Thank you. So can we hold that question for the next panel? Is that okay? Thank you so much, good sir. I really appreciate all the questions, and I realize I didn't introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Perel. I serve as a representative for the Baha'i International Community. I also help to coordinate the NGO access for the stakeholder engagement in the disaster risk reduction space. If you have disaster risk reduction questions, you can turn to us. And now I have the pleasure to hand the floor back over to Jacqueline, who is actually coordinating that whole space. So good luck to her, and good luck on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you for setting the stage on the finance. And we have more expert panels at the next stage talking about the government level of financing and also the experiences from the local level. However, I just missed one thing at the beginning. I would like to thank and acknowledge all the partners who have together put this event together. One is Avian Foundation, UNDRR-SEM Stakeholder Mechanism, Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, SeaTrust Institute, Greener Impact International, and Major Group for Children and Youth. Thank you so much, everyone, for the hard work. So let's give a clap for everyone. So, okay, well. So we have to come back to finance now. So the first speaker we have is Victoria. So she's the coordinator of BASE, B-A-S-E. So building approaches to fund local solution with climate evidence. So BASE supports and promotes funding for locally driven climate solutions using approaches that ensure that rigorous climate, rational simplicity and speed. So I think we have the best speaker to share with us on the financing the local actions. So with this, we also have our second speaker for this, who is Andrews, and he is the regional manager of the Resilience and Climate Transition Program in Avian Foundation and coordinates the Avian Andrews Resilience Climato project in Ecuador. Am I pronouncing it right? Yes, thank you. So, and at this COP, he coordinates the group of G77 and China of Finance Negotiation. So I would hand over the floor to our speakers to share about the local financing, and also we'd hear about the NDCs through localized adaptation finance. So I leave the floor to Victoria first. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here in this very important issue that we want to discuss and share with you, that is regarding climate finance. as you may all know, and perhaps agree with me, is one of the most pressing issues that we want to address at this COP. But climate finance, as we know, is one of the most important things to combat climate crisis. But it's not only about amount, but it's also about quality and how this climate finance reaches the most vulnerable communities, the ones that are in the local south. So these communities in the local south are guardians of traditional knowledge and can provide with innovative solutions to tackle climate change, with solutions to provide to mitigation and adaptation. So perhaps you will all agree with me that they should be one of the key receivers of the climate finance, but this is not the case. Only 10% of climate finance actually reaches the local level. So there are many challenges why climate finance does not reach the local level. And one of them is developing a climate rationale. Perhaps many of you, as project proponents or having been implementing a project, know that developing a climate rationale, that basically implies that project proponents must make sure that the project they are wanting to propose to access finance actually responds to a problem caused by climate change, and that solutions are addressed to promote that kind of solutions that are needed to combat climate change. But developing this climate rationale is really time-consuming, resource-consuming. It often takes gathering data from hydrometeorological stations from 20 years ago and making and developing climate scenarios for the future, and using a lot of technology and resources to gather this information and process it. Often this information is scattered in different institutions, especially in developing countries. So there are many challenges to develop this climate rationale, especially for local communities. And that is why we understood that addressing this particular challenge when developing a project that wants to obtain climate finance was one of the main drivers, and that made us in Fundación Avina realize that we wanted to make something to address and tackle this problem. And that is the reason why BASE, our initiative that is also can be called BASE or BASI, that is pronounced in different languages, that is short for Building Approaches to Fund Local Solutions with Climate Evidence, was born. So we, with this initiative that is was designed as a task force to work collaboratively with other partners and associated initiatives to tackle this particular challenge: more and better access to climate finance, reaching the local level with speed, simplicity, and climate rationale. And in that regard, we believe that by doing that, we need to focus on basically 3 approaches that we want to combine in BASE, that are research, action, and advocacy. And that's why we developed BASE with this 3-pillar strategy that are funding, learning, and scale. So what are we going to do? We want to implement grants and take resources to the ground to make a proof of concept that resources can actually get in the ground with simplicity and speed, and at the same time making the development of the climate rationale more easily, and at the same time proving that the impact of the solutions actually addresses the different problems caused by climate change on mitigation and adaptation. And these grant schemes that we are about to design and then implement are going to be offered to BASIS partners. This is a crucial thing that I wanted to share with you, because we really believe that one of the main issues is trust. So initiatives and organizations that are already working with our partners have developed this trust, and after working many years together, and we really want to build upon that efforts to offer these grants to enhance the solutions that are promoted and the trust relationships that have been built over these years. And by implementing these grants, we want to learn what works, what doesn't work when implementing, with all the process of implementing the grants, the design of that grant, and by also gathering evidence of the impact of the solutions that we implement in the ground. And we want to take what we have learned during the different implementation of the grant schemes that we are expecting to launch soon, and take this, what we have learned, to public and private financing entities and to governments as well, because we really want to help change and promote new approaches to climate finance reaching the local level. And I want to end by saying that we are really happy to be launching this new initiative based at this COP with you. BASE is actually coordinated by Fundación Avina, and is also integrated by partners that are here with us, which I'm really happy, that are Rainforest, Forest Trends, FLAC, HIVOS, Rios Partners, Pawanka Fund, the United Nations University, and with the general support from Skoll Foundation. And we have two aligned initiatives that are VCA and Impulse South. So we are really hoping in this conference to exchange with you. So please do approach us. We really want to have this opportunity to share thoughts, learn from you, understand what ideas, what experiences you have to share regarding the implementation of grants to reach the local ground, to make the best possible solution when we design our methodology and strategy to define the way the grants are going to hit the ground. So with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So moving to our next speaker, as he comes from a huge amount of experiences and also as a negotiator. So I would like to ask you, so your experiences from the local communities with regard to accessing climate finance and how the government can help in overcoming those obstacles. So over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. Just allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Andres. I work in Fundación Avina as the manager of our climate program. And I'm also here as part of the Ecuadorian delegation and involved in negotiations. I don't know if it's a good thing when people say you're involved in the negotiations or a bad thing, but there's an experience there. And I'm coordinating the group of G77 on China for finance negotiations, so I can speak about that. And I can speak about the experience of the Global South on finance a lot. I know I have 5 minutes, so I'll begin my timer if that's okay. Otherwise, I'll just rant on and on like a crazy person. So first, to try and respond to that question and maybe bring back the conversation to a local level and local experience. I'm also coordinating a project on family agriculture in Ecuador. It's focused on adaptation and improving resilience of family agriculture and peasants. And one of the components in that project has to do with access to finance. And it's interesting to see how far those conversations and those realities are from this space. Because when you look at what we discuss in the finance room, in the finance rooms, and the conversations around GCF, GEF, Adaptation Fund, NCQG, and all of those acronyms that mean nothing on the ground. What people really need is something that works relatively easy, fast, less requirements. This issue of climate rationality in particular is one of the biggest obstacles for the beneficiaries that we've seen in the Andes Resilientes project. And finance institutions at that level as well have very little knowledge on climate change or interest in creating a line of credit, for instance, on adaptation or mitigation, because what that means in practice is for them to monitor additional things, to have to develop additional capacity, and to receive less interests, less revenues for the credits that they issue. So there's been also very little interest from the financial sector at the local level to get involved in these level of conversations. And when you come back and look at the international climate funds, it can take up anything from 1.5 years to 5 years to have a project approved. And that project needs to be a cross-cutting project with impact, with stakeholders from many different levels, regions, countries. It has to be a giant program by a giant implementing entity, hundreds of millions of dollars. And that, as much as we continue adding on those that seemingly wonderful adjectives for a project, it gets farther and farther from the ground. And we've seen projects, multi-country projects, where countries are not even aware that they're part of that list. They didn't know they were part of that list. And implementing agencies handling hundreds of millions of dollars in projects that don't necessarily reach people on the ground. And that's an issue, and there's a role for national governments to step in here. And from my experience, at least when we talk about what we in Avina call traditional climate finance, so the GCF, GEF, everything that we immediately think when we think climate finance, there's a role of national governments in accessing traditional climate finance. Most are intermediaries between the beneficiaries and the funds, be it through an official name like a national designated authority, or something that works more in practice like signing a support letter for the adaptation fund. But national governments are there. And it seems like sometimes the agendas of national governments aren't in line with enabling local communities to access funds. And that is a sad reality. Most of what we've seen also in terms of national governments proposing projects is projects that they have been involved in the elaboration and that they will be involved in the implementation, but that sometimes are farther from local communities. So I think it's important first to exert pressure upon local governments to have an agenda with local communities. Aside from enabling access to climate finance, having an agenda with local communities, that involves, for instance, having an agenda at the national level with civil society, women's groups, youth, indigenous peoples, around pressuring the government to include them in their planning for NDC, for NDCs and climate action in general, in the implementation of these actions, in the monitoring of these actions, and eventually in accessing and implementing those funds. And I've seen interesting experiences coming from Ecuador, for instance, particularly on RED Plus results-based payments, where a grant and a results-based payment project was approved by the GCF, but a proportion of that was directly implemented by indigenous communities in the Amazon. And it's something that can happen, but requires some time of work and institutional arrangements and creating that agenda with governments on work with local communities and minorities. And just to come back to the conversation of private finance and bilateral finance. On private finance, for instance, we've seen, and there's a lot of talk in the finance rooms on private finance, but 86% of private finance is going to mitigation. And that is not necessarily the need of local communities. So there's a need for us to reflect upon what sources are more suitable for the needs, urgency, and scale of local communities. And finally, and I'll close with that because I'm 1 minute over my 5 minutes, On bilateral finance, we've seen bilateral finance is one of the biggest sources of finance that reaches local communities to some extent, because it is more focused on adaptation than mitigation. But still, in bilateral finance, almost 50% is still refundable. And that is a challenge for local communities accessing these types of refundable financial instruments. So there needs to be a reflection then, again, around the types of financial instruments that are needed for local communities and how you enable that access at that level. And I will leave it at that. I can come back if there are any questions, but happy to engage and respond to anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So with this, I now open the floor for questions. So I saw before we start the session, there was one hand raised. So I would like to start with you.
It's working. Just like a general thing, because normally here we see millions of dollars, how we are going to allocate them in different communities. So I think like the humanity in the work we have done, we are reaching this point where we pollute so much. So whatever we need to do, it has to be new in order to stop doing what we have been doing, right? So that's called normally innovation. And so we will have to innovate in two ways. That is a normal way to separate innovation. It's innovation incremental or disruptive. And normally innovation in the places where you are used to do innovation, you know that 90% of the projects that you are going to do, they're not going to work. Because you need to do them in order to realize that that one project worked. And normally there's no money for that 99 projects. And people want to allocate the money, and governments and companies and banks want to allocate the money in the 1% of those projects because they are reliable, they know, they give results. So even in communities, it's the same approach. How you allocate money to all those 99% who are not going to work, you know? But if we do not finance them, we're not going to have those, you know, the successful ones who really give the results. So this is very tricky because at the end, how do you demonstrate that your project is going to be a very good one compared to the other ones? And you made some examples that how you talk with the communities and perhaps you have a sixth sense. So to end up the question is how, as a world or the institutions that you represent, can allocate money to projects that won't be successful, but we need to finance them.
You want to go with the first question and then we take the other ones? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. What's your name? Lorenzo. Do you work in Fundación Avina, Lorenzo? Because I heard you mentioning a lot of words that we use all the time in our reflections: innovation, disruption, collaboration. That's what we're trying to do with BASE. We're aware that, just like you said, 90% of projects are not bankable, like we say, that like developed countries would like us to have bankable projects that will generate revenue, that are a good investment, that attract the private sector, that are sexy for the private sector. They're not. Particularly local projects or adaptation projects, or even worse, loss and damage projects, they're not attractive at all. And we're aware of that, and the reason they're not attractive is because the lens through which we look at the project, our lens that we've been creating in the last decade. So we look at a project and we think, does it have an MRV system? Are the indicators transparent? Are the governance arrangements there? Are we going to have traceability of all of the expenditures and the investments in the project? And probably it doesn't. I think those are the exact same obstacles that have prevented local communities from accessing finance. So the value added and what we're trying to do with BASE, aside from actually managing to finance a couple of these projects, is to create a learning curve, to learn from what we're doing, to try and remove that chip of having worked in the climate world all of these years and the climate finance world, which isn't as good as one might think, and just reflect within what we're doing on what other governance arrangements are there. It's one thing to tell a local community you have no governance arrangements for a climate project, but communities do have governance arrangements. They just don't have the same governance arrangements that we would expect, and they are monitoring things. And we know the local communities are at the front line of biodiversity conservation, for instance. But it's difficult to, and the reflection that one of our colleagues who worked in Avina, who's an indigenous colleague, told us is, what we're doing is we're replicating colonist practices within our own people. You're replicating colonization. And it made me feel bad. Honestly, it made me feel like this is not something that we should do. I mean, how can we go to a community and tell them, this is the problem that you're having locally, I know better, this is what you should do, this is how you should measure it, because we know best. So what we're trying to do is think on a case-by-case basis, what type of governance arrangement is best, what type of instrument in terms of financing is best, what types of MRV arrangements and indicators are best. And as we do that, we intend to do at least 3 calls for proposals, and then we'll run out. Hopefully we'll find something to replenish. But in these calls of proposals come up with lessons learned. And for me, at least having negotiated in the finance world, the most important thing are those lessons learned and how we position them in the traditional discussion on climate finance. We've lessons learned. We know some things work, some things don't work, but we're learning new things about what does work. And just to give you an example, and trying not to talk too much, the IPCC, for instance, puts out reports that are very detailed reports. I don't know if you've seen them. They're thousands of pages long. But within those reports, you have even projected impacts on each region. You know what is more or less going to happen in each region. And when you look at those impacts, you also have suggestions on what kinds of actions you should take for those impacts. So the information is there. So for me, it's a redundancy to ask of each of those actions in the regions where you know those impacts are happening to again prove that those actions are related to climate and that they will help the climate fight. It's a redundancy, but we're doing it. And we'll try and reflect upon that in the climate rationality discussion that Vicky was telling you about, and hopefully come with some lessons learned that we'll come back and position and try to discuss with the funds and tell them there's a different way of doing things and see where that leads us. But it takes a first step and a bold step to do it, and we're happy with our partners that have agreed to take that step with us. And sorry, thank you.
I want to compliment on what Andres was saying, and thank you for your question. Very, very interesting to share with you some of the reflections of a consultative process that we organized here together with our partners of the Adaptation Research Alliance. It was really interesting what we have discovered regarding how can we make some breakthroughs to this challenge of developing a climate the climate rationale of the projects. And regarding the question specifically, when you say that innovation can be incremental or disruptive, I would say that BASE is trying to make this as a disruptive change. We want to find and propose new ways for climate finance reaching the local level, and what I wanted to share from this consultative process is that one of the main issues has to do with trust. So in that regard, I think it's really important that we at BASE are going to work and offer these grants to the initiatives and organizations that our partners are already working with. Because that way we are making sure that all of that relationships that perhaps can make that projects work and projects don't work can be perhaps more easily going because those partners know the initiatives and organizations that are going to be funded. So hopefully, let's meet again next year to tell you more about the results of the first grants that we are going to offer, and can happily share what we have discovered. But we strongly believe that, as also Lynn was saying at the beginning, working collaboratively is the main source of power we have to make things change. So if we build upon each other's efforts and we trust each other, these relationships can provide better solutions. Communities will find more easily going with perhaps approaches that are hard for them to easily resolve, as Andres was mentioning before. If communities want to get to a fund like GCF, for instance, the accountability and the traceability of each dollar spent would be very hard for them to make proof that each dollar spent can be proof of the climate impact of the project by using receipts or invoices. But how can if we prove that there are other ways to prove that climate impact is being effectively there in the projects, but in different ways of showing that? For instance, taking photos of the results of the solutions or signatures of the chiefs of the communities.
Thank you so much. I see there is one question at the back here. Okay, we have 1, 2, can I see more hands? 3, 4, 5. Okay, so I would request if we can take the questions together, and then I'll open the floor to all our lovely panelists to respond to the questions. Yeah. So may we have the first question? Who wants to go? 1, 2, 3. Who wants to go first?
Hello,
Yep.
My name is Pankaj and I come from Bangladesh, which is one of the most vulnerable country to climate change. I don't have a comment, but it's a suggestion based on working for so many years for climate change. When you're talking about new disruption or innovations, it is better to approach a no regret approach. Like certain projects might not work. There might be not positive outcomes, or there might be outcomes which might be something different. So any kind of project which you do for climate change, that no regret approach should be done. That's one point of it. And the second point, I think you started mentioning about it. It is very important that IPCC AR6 report had detailed recommendations of the region and specific. But the challenge here is that it talks about the sub-region. It does not talk about country specific. It does not talk about localized things. So next year when we come to COP, we would be very interested to know that any particular project which you have done, how did it adapt it to loss and damage? How did it adapt it to adaptation? How did it adapt it to mitigation? And a robust learning framework needs to be put in place. Because if we want to attract donors, if we want to attract private sector, they need this kind of evidences. Otherwise, this will just mere remain as a project with no usefulness later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I saw there is another hand raised at that side. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, everybody. I'm Fernanda Lopes from Brazil. It's not a question, but it's I'd like to share some lessons learned for our work in Brazil. We are a grant maker institution called Baobab Fund for Racial Equity. And during these years that we are funding with small grants, more than 90% of all projects are working. More than 90% have never received any grant. So, and sometimes it's not an innovation, but it's how to guarantee a strategy, an efficient strategy to lead with the loss and damage, and how to be resilient. And they always can, for example, be transparency if we guarantee to our grantees some technical assistance to be able not to fill the forms necessarily, but to present all evidence, and including how to fill the forms. So I think we as grant makers may understand more needs and expectation of our grantees, of our field. And when we offer some support, considering this as the base of our work, it will be easier. So this is the most important thing to consider. All projects are successful because we are doing our grant maker according to their needs, not according to our priorities.
Thank you. I see there's few hands at the right hand. Okay.
Sorry, I'm Cássio. I'm from Brazil as well. I'm working at the umbrella organization, Association of Institutes and Foundations. I just want to add an idea about trust, and I totally agree about the needs to trust in the organization, and I think that we have to put another lens to see what works and what doesn't work. Because the length of profitable length, it's important, I agree, but it's not enough. For us in Brazil, we are sure, we are very confident that it's not enough, because one project that supposedly doesn't work, it can touch the self-esteem of many of people. And this self-esteem can change other things, not that project, especially that one, but can change many others. So I think we can mix the idea of profitable and change the self-esteem of people. That's, for me, that works, you know.
Thank you. We have so many hands at the right-hand side of, so can you please pass the mic? And I would also request Ms. Wilson and Mr. Abraham, if you want to respond to the questions.
Hi, my name's Sienna. I'm at New York University Law School in the Global Justice Clinic, and we work doing advocacy with peasant communities in Haiti and my Indigenous colleagues from Guyana here. And I have a question about how you think about local government when you think about getting financing to the grassroots. So a question based on our experience in Haiti, as our partners think a lot about their finance and adaptation demands, is some see a concern about themselves stepping into the role of actually doing adaptation work on the ground in a context of further stepping in the place of the government and eroding further the relationship of responsibility and accountability between their communities and particularly the national government. At the same time, they don't necessarily trust that money that will go through the national government will actually be directed to them. But they do have much better working relationships at the mayoral level, at the very localized government level. And so I'm interested, as you think about getting money to the local level, how do you think about working with really local level governments? And if there are obstacles to doing that, it would also be really interesting to hear you speak about those.
Hello, I'm Laurice Hamero from Manila Observatory from the Philippines. So I was just wondering whether there's a possibility that funders will reconsider their climate rational requirement because, well, I'm a climate scientist and I think it's more of a technical bureaucracy. It requires data and a lot of local communities don't have data. And at the same time, if you have the climate scenarios, they are low resolution, typically 25 kilometers by 25 kilometers, which doesn't really say much, for example, small islands. So an alternative approach that researchers have found is taking a more pro-poor approach, looking into building adaptive capacity, sometimes through development-oriented projects. So in theory, a lot of funders are adamant about distinguishing between adaptation and development. But then researchers have found that in practice, in reality, there's really not much difference between an adaptation project and a development project. So in other words, adaptation is development. So I was wondering if funders will eventually relent on their climate rational requirement. Thank you.
Were there more
Is
questions?
there more questions? No? Okay. Thank you so much. I really need to have a sip with the intense discussion. So maybe I'll start with you, Ms. Wilson.
Well, from that rich group of interventions and questions, I would say that I heard an awful lot about establishing trust, about funding the 99% of projects that are unproven, about getting money really to the local level and not having it all sort of disappear on the way down the ladder from the funder to the project, and about the role of what is really adaptive capacity building. Okay, so if you take all that together, and mostly there were interventions, but some questions, I guess what I heard out of all of that is that we're still at the same place we've been for all of these decades of trying to answer the question. It reminds me of early days of writing grants where you were told, don't, write your project and get it funded, don't write to the funder, but we've all learned how to write to the funder. And that's what we're talking about here, is how do we not do that? How do we create a new system in which we don't have to do that? Well, part of what's happening is what I said about the blended finance issue and problem that hasn't worked. And so perhaps the new structure needs to engage the people who really need the projects in Brazil or in wherever we're talking about in the structure of how that partnership works. In order to do that, you have to bring in actual people who live in those communities to be part of that process, because one size will not fit all. At least that's the way I would see it. While good practices need to be maintained, we have a real disconnect in terms of it getting to, say, Haiti and to the projects that you're talking about, because those people weren't involved in the process of how that finance was going to flow. And money tends to evaporate before it gets to where it needs to get to the projects. So my recommendation in restructuring that, and this is going to lead me to a question of one of my fellow panelists, is how do those projects establish trust that you don't know about? What is the thing those places you don't know, how do the communities, community leaders, people who live there, work there, are worried about what's happened in their community, the disasters and whatever. How do they interweave what they need in the planning of how finance is going to be distributed, not just a talk about it, but how do we actually do it? And I think it may have to be driven by the local community to come up with the solution and bring it back up. I don't think it's going to come from the top. I think we're going to have, and this is the reason, having worked in this field for numbers of decades now, I gave you the project example I gave you because it was a group of frustrated people who lived there and watched nothing happening. that put it together and said, as a community leaders, we have to do something, even if we have to pay for it to show that it works, because those fund projects, as was rightly said, don't get funded. And so in the absence of being one of those trusted partners or usual suspects, how do you get that? You basically start it and then come and say, now we're looking for partners. It's a long-term development process. So I think that's what I would have to say about that in part. But I would really like to know from my co-panelists down there, how do these people establish trust?
Okay, thank you. I think from what's been said, 3 key things jump to me. And one is anticipatory finance. And I think someone asked a question about we know the things that happen. And I probably would throw that to my colleagues who have more experience in terms of financing and negotiating on financing, because it seems as if we always wait for some of these impacts to happen before we now start looking for financial, support for local communities, when we know there's the signs, there's the, everything shows that these are the likely impacts. Why haven't we seen a lot of finance, instruments being made available for that? So I feel that anticipatory finance is really, really important. The other one is the colonial approach to, giving out support. It's really, really messy. And recently I was involved in a consultancy where we're talking about nature-based solutions with indigenous people. And one of the indigenous leaders, she just said, look, we had this project where one of the big organizations came in, they gave us money, and they told us how to implement the project. Now, you are trying to get indigenous people to use their indigenous knowledge as a nature-based solutions, yet you are telling them how they should go about it so that it meets donors' specifications. And so we really have to rethink, how we approach giving out finance, because the colonial approach to what is bankable, what is, measurable, needs to really be changed. We have to relook at that. And the last one is on local governments. I think local governments are really, really key if we really want to reach the local people. And the problem with a lot of developing countries or global south countries is that the political structure, when you look at the local governments, is really bad. It doesn't help the local governments to be independent, to be able to take initiative. And that needs to be changed. Once the local governments have some sort of authority to be able to work, to be able to stand as a guarantee, they are able to work with the local communities. They are able to support young people, women. So I feel that there needs to be, as we talk about finance, we also have to look at the political side of helping these funds reach the local people. And as we are pushing for that, we also push that these structures be changed so that there's close collaboration on that level. Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions and comments. I will try to do my best to address all of the ones that I took notes and can add value to what my colleague has just shared. To begin with, addressing the issue regarding climate rationale, it's really difficult one, and in this consultative process that I was mentioning before, that you are most welcome to take the postcards that are on that table that have like a little image of the results, and you can download the report for more information. We found that developing the climate rationale basically can be done using different kinds of information, different kinds of evidence, but mainly 2. One is climate science, and the other one is traditional knowledge. So this is really important to put value on traditional knowledge to complement climate science, because they should not be working separately. One has a lot to say to the other one, and we have to really see them as working as pairs. many times traditional knowledge can bridge these gaps regarding what you were saying, regarding scale of information, regarding the lack of data that many developing countries have of past information or continuity of this information. And once more regarding trust, local communities are there. They are at the front line of the impacts of climate change. And we have to trust that they are the most interested ones to build resilience to be prepared to these impacts. So they have the solutions, they know the problems. We have to make sure that they are on the table and offer this information to build the climate rationale as well. And on the other hand, another issue that was raised was regarding the type of finance. And locally led adaptation principles, if you have read them before, talk about predictability, flexibility, and patient finance. And this is the kind of finance we need when we talk about projects that are locally led. And this also includes one other important element that our friend here from Brazil was mentioning regarding building and strengthening capacities. This is a really key issue that every project should consider, because the idea of allocating resources or moving or accessing resources for communities, and then when the project ends and the resources are not there anymore, we need to make sure that the communities have something left. So, for instance, if we want to promote the use of ICTs, we have to make sure that the communities know how to use them, they are not internet dependent, and really strengthen the governance, because they are the ones that live in the territories, know them better than anyone, and the projects should, as Andres was saying before, not come and bring the solutions, but work with the community to understand what the solutions they need. They understand that they are better for them, to promote and enhance those solutions.
Thank you. May I request Andres? I also request, like, keeping in mind the time, if you can address it, it's short, so it'll be really appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, I think most of the questions have already been responded, so I'll just provide a very short reflection with regards to your comment. I'm not sure if traditional climate finance will ever be less restrictive in terms of accessing. But we do have to recognize that there's an unbalance in the way that we're doing things. I mean, it takes us so much to say that this is a climate project versus a development project. It takes way too much. And those criteria are usually more related to a higher level of a lower level of vulnerability and a higher level of capacity. But if you look at the most vulnerable and the least resilient communities, climate data around what you need to do in those communities is honestly irrelevant. It's irrelevant. If you have a community that has its means of life threatened, you know what you need to do, and it might be difficult in those peculiar cases to make the case of climate rationality. That doesn't mean that it's not an adaptation project, but it just means that traditional climate finance is not ready to work with the most vulnerable. It works with the least vulnerable, who have the capacities and the time and the access of information and the technology available and the data, but it doesn't work with the most vulnerable, because the most vulnerable at that level, climate rationality tends to become irrelevant. So that's just the reflection that I wanted to add.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the most active and enriching discussions. Now I hand it over to Dan for the key takeaway messages.
Yes, thank you for that. That was very stimulating. I really appreciate all the questions and comments. So I've been asked to provide some takeaway messages and then turn over to my dear colleague Alvaro Rojas for closing remarks. So I'm going to make mine very short because he's a lot smarter. So all I took from this, which I thought was great in a finance space, is co-truly. Now you might be asking what that means. So co, that's the C, that's for community. Each locality is different and we have to recognize and embrace that. O is for ownership. The more we can collectively engage in these processes, the more validity and durability we'll have. T, the true part is for trust, because that has come up a number of times and I think it's something we can't emphasize enough, and trust is something we have to build together. The L is for learning. There is no one solution, it's all about the process. E is for experimentation. We have to find ways, as that gentleman in the back said, find ways to finance innovative approaches based on a scientific method, which implies actually failure in addition to success. That's failure in quotes, that's a learning process. And then the other part of E, because truly has a Y at the end, is youth. Youth are key to all of this. They are some of the best innovators, most creative individuals. So those are my key takeaways. But more importantly, I will now introduce Mr. Alvaro Rojas, who's the Senior Project Associate at MCII and the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. So Alvaro, what are your thoughts from today's discussion? And if you need a microphone, you can sit here. The microphone's coming to you.
Hello. Thanks. I just want to start by saying thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think I've learned much more than I am able to contribute from all these very rich discussions. My name is Alvaro Rojas. I'm part of UNU-EHS as well as the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. I guess I have a little comment regarding the discussions that we're having before. It may sound a bit antagonic in the sense that it goes to this concept of bankable ideas. I am not sure that 99% of the trials will fail. I just think that maybe the way we are valuing their benefits, it's maybe not the right approach. There is this theory of the triple dividend, which is economic, social, and environmental. Something that we're trying to do, or we're in early stages of, is figuring out how to quantify this benefit as a way to make many of these organizations realize and be a little bit more easier to communicate what these benefits are, right? And that should open an opportunity to say, let's not think this adaptation as only risk reduction or only from this perspective, but this has all these other benefits that this investment had, and maybe the risk reduction cannot be felt right now or in the next disaster event, but is building up. So maybe that is something that I would like to add to this conversation. I also wanted to reflect in this very, rich title that we chose for today's side event in the theme of reducing loss and damage and the topic of inequity cycles. This conversation of loss and damage right now is extremely hot, and there are a lot of thoughts coming in and out from my area of expertise, that is risk analytics and disaster risk finance. There is the key message that is also part of this excellent takeaway messages that you share with us is the concept of collaboration. We started by saying youth has a very important role. It's true. The elderly has a very important role to play. That part is true. Communities in different levels and academia has a very important role to play as well. So I would encourage, and that is something that also from my side, from a bit more of the academic side also goes, let's build these networks of collaboration, right? And let's make them very result-oriented. Let's bring tools that can be used and reproduced. All these targets that we're talking about, 2030, it's already basically upon us, right? 2050, it's already happening to us. And we should not, in my opinion, focus, just give the focus to the youth for the sake they're youth. They will be the elderly or the middle age by 2050, right? So it is important that we provide spots for everyone to be part of, and that we develop tools that we're able to replicate and scale up, because the knowledge, for example, that you shared here, that our colleagues from Brazil shared here on a lot of these conversations that we're having, I think they're relevant in many contexts. And maybe I just close with this discussion or this topic about development versus climate. I think both the adaptation community evolved a little bit or took a lot of lessons from the development community. And I think the other way around will also end up contributing, but it goes again to this idea of collaboration and stop working in silos, because development needs to be climate resilient. So it just cannot be a thought of, let's go back just to discuss more. And so thanks again, everyone, for just this very rich collaboration, and to the organizers, just a clap from my side. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, of course. And thank you once again to all of our speakers, all of our co-sponsors. Thank you for joining us this morning into the afternoon. Enjoy the super hot weather out there. Now that you've been in here for an hour and a half, it's been really delightful. I've learned a lot. I hope you have too. Have a wonderful balance of COP27 and all the best in all your endeavors.